What if love were not a shelter, but a warning we ignored for far too long? What if what we call an encounter were, in truth, an ancient recognition, silent, patient, waiting only for the right moment to happen? What if some stories began long before the first word, and waited for the right night to collect everything at once? There are questions that are not born to be answered. They are born to walk beside us, to follow us through the corridors of memory, through the detours of the heart, through the choices we believe are free, when they already carry the weight of something decided long before us, questions that settle in like long shadows, stretching over every gesture, every promise, every kiss that feels too innocent to be true. What if the love we swore to protect was in fact the first step toward survival? What if the romance we believed would save us was only the most delicate way of leading us into danger? There are nights that do not come to rest. They come to reveal. They arrive like an ancient whisper crossing time itself, bringing with them memories we never lived, promises we don't remember making, and the unsettling sense that something, or someone, has always been waiting for us with absolute patience. Perhaps that is what destiny truly is, not a grand force, but a silent wait, a discreet presence that watches while we love, while we believe, while we surrender, unaware that every step takes us farther from any chance of return. Because there are loves that do not begin to bloom, they begin to endure. There are encounters that do not ask for surrender, they demand permanence. And there are nights that transform everything that was tenderness into instinct, everything that was promise into struggle, everything that was romance into survival. That night I didn't know any of this yet. I still believed love was a safe place. I still didn't understand that some doors open only to never close the same way again. That was how it all began. Not with a scream, not with a clear warning, but with a soft and deeply wrong feeling that I had finally arrived where I was meant to be. And it was exactly there that danger began to learn my name. The transition was almost imperceptible, a shift in the air, a different weight in the silence, as if the world around me had taken a step back, making room for something older to approach. The path leading to the mansion was narrow, lined with tall trees whose branches intertwined overhead, forming a kind of natural tunnel. Leaves rustled in the night wind, producing a steady, almost breathing sound, as if the place itself had its own rhythm. The house revealed itself slowly, with the calm of something that knows it doesn't need to impress. It stood solid and dark, with tall, silent windows reflecting only fragments of the moon hidden behind heavy clouds. There was something about it that didn't match abandonment. It wasn't neglect, it was waiting. The mansion did not seem empty, it seemed aware. The iron gate stood slightly ajar, creaking softly with each movement of the wind. There were no broken chains, no signs of forced entry, only that discreet opening, almost polite, as if the house had anticipated my arrival. The garden, though overtaken by overgrown vegetation, still preserved a visible design. Stone paths covered in moss, flower beds that had once been carefully tended. The scent of damp earth mixed with the distant perfume of night-blooming flowers, creating an atmosphere that was strangely welcoming. It was there that I felt for the first time the contradiction that would define everything that followed, the desire to enter and the impulse to flee existing in the very same moment. I was not alone on that journey. The love that led me there walked beside me, not only physically, but as a constant presence, a promise of safety. I believed I knew every gesture, every silence, every intention. I believed that romance was the only stable thing in a world that had already begun to collapse from within. Maybe that's why I ignored the signs. Maybe that's why I accepted discomfort as excitement, the chill down my spine as nerves, the silence of the house as rest. When I crossed the gate, I felt the unmistakable sensation of passing an invisible boundary. The sound of the distant road vanished. The air grew heavier, slower. Each step on the stone path echoed too loudly, as if the mansion itself were counting my movements, recording my presence. The front door rose before me, imposing. Dark wood marked by time, yet far too solid to be merely a relic of the past. Before I even touched it, something in me understood, without words, that this entrance was not only physical, it was irreversible. When the door opened, the interior revealed itself in profound stillness. The scent of old wood, settled dust, and something faintly sweet wrapped around my senses. The hall was vast, with worn marble floors and a curved staircase disappearing into the upper level. Along the walls, old portraits watched in silence, faces that seemed to carry too many stories for a single gaze. The mansion did not react to my entrance. It simply received me. And as I took my first steps inside, not knowing exactly what I was seeking, a quiet certainty began to form, slow and inevitable. That night, the romance that had brought me there would no longer be protection, and I had no idea yet that, very soon, loving would mean resisting. The mansion's first impression was one of balance. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The silence was not aggressive, it was organized, almost respectful. Dim light from a few lamps on the ground floor drew long, soft shadows, as if the space had learned to coexist with the half-dark. The high ceiling amplified every breath, every step, not in a threatening way, but in an aware one. There was a curious sense of care in that environment, not living, recent care, but an old devotion, preserved by habit, like someone who continues to tidy a house long after losing the original reason to do so. The furniture was coated with a fine layer of dust, yet positioned with intention. Nothing seemed hastily abandoned. Everything had been left with time, with choice. The love beside me that night seemed far too comfortable there. There was something unsettlingly natural in the way he moved through the house, as if he recognized the corridors, as if he knew exactly where to step to avoid the louder creaks of the old floor. I attributed that to the sense of safety I had always associated with his presence. He had always known how to navigate difficult situations calmly. He always seemed one step ahead of chaos. Maybe that's why I let myself be guided. As we moved through the hall, my eyes traced the details, the slightly dulled golden frames, the tall mirrors reflecting fragments of the space, never the whole, the closed doors aligned too perfectly for a house that was supposedly empty. There was something ritualistic about that place, as if every object had been positioned not only for aesthetics but for memory. That's when I noticed the first detail I couldn't explain. On a side table rested an arrangement of fresh flowers, not wilted, not dried, fresh. Their scent was delicate, discreet, yet present enough to betray recent care. I touched one of the petals with my fingertips and felt its living texture, cool, real. The simplest explanation would have been the most logical. Someone still maintained the house, a caretaker perhaps, a distant relative. But the feeling that settled inside me was not relief, it was displacement, as if I had arrived late to a scene that was still unfolding. The romance, however, acted as an emotional buffer. It always had. Where there was doubt, it offered calm. Where there was fear, it offered explanation. I wanted to believe. I needed to believe. Because admitting that something was wrong would mean accepting that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. We climbed the staircase slowly. The handrail was cold to the touch. The marble steps bore subtle marks of continuous use, as if many people had passed through there over the years, and not only in a distant past. On the upper floor, a long corridor stretched before us, lined with closed doors. The dark-toned wallpaper displayed old patterns that repeated in hypnotic, almost organic intervals. As I walked, I had the strange impression that the corridor didn't end exactly where it should, as if the distance subtly stretched the farther we went. I blinked a few times, attributing the sensation to travel fatigue, to the tension accumulated over recent days. That's when I noticed the sounds. They weren't clear footsteps or obvious noises. They were small variations, in silence. A faint crack behind a wall, a creak that didn't match our movements, a breath of air that came from no open window. The house seemed to respond to our presence in an almost organic way, like a body slowly waking from a prolonged rest. The bedroom we settled into lay at the end of the corridor. The door opened with excessive ease, as if it had been used recently. Inside, the room was spacious, with a large dark wood bed, heavy curtains filtering the moonlight, and a thick rug muffling footsteps. The scent there was different from the rest of the house, more intimate, more concentrated. An old floral perfume, embedded in the fibers of the fabric. That fragrance struck me unexpectedly. It wasn't unpleasant. On the contrary, there was something about it that felt too familiar, like a memory I couldn't fully access. For a moment, I had the unsettling sensation that I had been there before. Not in that house, not in that life, but somewhere very close to it. I pushed the thought away. The romance seemed calm, comfortable, safe. There were gentle gestures, quiet closeness, the false sense of normalcy that so often precedes collapse. The house, meanwhile, remained still, watching, waiting. Later, when the silence of the night thickened and the outside world seemed to disappear completely, I got up to explore a little more, not out of curiosity alone, but because of a growing restlessness that refused to settle. I walked the corridor again, feeling the carpet beneath my feet, the air growing colder as I moved away from the bedroom. That's when I found the first door left ajar. I didn't remember seeing it before. Maybe it had been closed, Maybe I simply hadn't noticed it. The fact was, now it was there, inviting, revealing only a fragment of darkness inside. The gap seemed deeper than it should have been, as if the space beyond were larger than the house's architecture allowed. I approached slowly. The air around the door was colder, denser. Before I even touched it, a shiver ran down my spine, an instinctive reaction, older than reason. There was something there I wasn't ready to see. But the house, I was beginning to realize, didn't care about readiness. It simply waited for the precise moment when curiosity would overpower fear. And that moment was approaching. The door gave way with a low, restrained creak, as if the wood itself knew it shouldn't draw attention. The space beyond wasn't large, but it carried a strange density, as if the air had learned to linger there longer. Light from the corridor barely crossed the threshold, creating thick shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. It was a secondary sitting room, perhaps an old reading space. A low bookshelf stood against the wall, books arranged with care far too deliberate for a forgotten place. An armchair faced a window sealed by heavy curtains. The fabric was worn but clean, as if someone sat there often. The silence in that room was different. It wasn't empty, it was attentive. I moved closer, the floor creaking beneath my steps. The scent there was stronger, old wood, aged paper, and that persistent floral perfume, now more present, almost intimate. It felt as though the aroma was trying to tell me something, as if it carried a story that refused to remain asleep. On a small side table rested an object that shouldn't have been there, a porcelain teacup with remnants of dark tea still pooled at the bottom. The liquid was cold, but not dried. On the rim lingered a clear mark of lipstick, old enough not to be recent, yet far too preserved to have been left there years ago. The sight of the cup triggered immediate unease. It wasn't fear. It was the sensation of having arrived too late or too early to a place that had never truly stopped existing. I looked around, searching for a plausible explanation, a caretaker, an occasional visitor, someone who had entered before us. But none of those possibilities fully held. The house didn't convey intermittent abandonment. It conveyed continuity, as if it had never really been empty at all. When I touched the arm of the chair, I felt the fabric slightly warm. I pulled my hand back immediately, my heart racing on instinct. That contact made clear what I had been trying to deny since the moment I entered. There was someone there, not just recently. Someone remained. A soft sound echoed down the corridor, interrupting my thoughts. A footstep, a shift of air. I couldn't identify it precisely. I only felt my body react before my mind did, a shiver climbing my arms, my breathing growing shallow. I turned toward the door, but the hallway was empty. The silence had returned, now thicker, almost oppressive. The mansion seemed to observe my hesitation with absolute patience, as if it knew this was only the beginning. When I returned to the bedroom, I found the romance exactly as I had left it. The same calm, the same sense of normalcy, the same serene gaze that had always worked as an anchor. I described what I had seen vaguely, carefully, minimizing the details I myself couldn't yet understand. The response was immediate and predictable. Simple explanations, a calm tone, the comfortable certainty that old houses create illusions. And for a moment I almost believed it. But something had changed. I felt it with disturbing clarity. The house was no longer just a setting. It had become an active presence, a silent third element in that relationship. And I was beginning to realize that the romance somehow seemed more aligned with the mansion than with me. In the days that followed, small details began to accumulate, forming a pattern impossible to ignore. Objects shifted subtly. Doors I remembered closing appeared slightly open. The floral perfume surfaced in rooms I hadn't entered, always discreet, always persistent. There were sounds at night too. Not abrupt noises, but gentle movements, restrained footsteps, fabric being adjusted, someone moving through the corridors with far too much intimacy. They always stopped when I tried to locate them. They always returned when I gave up. The romance remained present, constant, protective, but something in its posture began to unsettle me. There was an excessive familiarity with the house's rhythms, a calmness that clashed with my growing sense of displacement. Sometimes I watched in silence, trying to pinpoint when that safety had begun to feel like surveillance. It was one quiet afternoon, as filtered light cast long shadows across the hall floor, that I noticed something new. A portrait I didn't remember seeing before hung near the staircase. The frame was old, delicately worked, and the photograph depicted a woman with a serene expression, deep, attentive eyes. There was something about her that unsettled me deeply. The resemblance wasn't immediate, but it was insistent. The line of the jaw, the angle of the face, the way her gaze seemed to pass straight through whoever looked at her. My chest tightened as I realized that the longer I stared, the harder it became to deny it. She could have been mistaken for me. The sense of déjà vu returned with force, accompanied by a silent question that refused to quiet. How many times had this story already been lived? That night, as the mansion's silence settled around us once again, I understood something essential. Though not yet fully clear, the romance that had brought me there might not have begun with me. And if that was true, I needed to find out who had occupied that place before me, because somewhere along the way, loving had stopped being a choice and had become repetition. From that day on, the mansion ceased to be merely a place where I was. It became a space that passed through me. There was an almost imperceptible change in the way I breathed inside it, as if my lungs had to adapt to older, denser air, laden with memories that weren't mine, yet insisted on settling within me. I began to notice patterns where I had once seen coincidences, the hour when the light moved through the corridors in the same way every day, the exact step on the staircase that creaked, regardless of who passed, the moment when the silence thickened as if something were approaching without ever fully revealing itself. The romance, in turn, seemed to deepen in strange synchronization with the house. There was more closeness, more gestures of care, more attention. But that care was always accompanied by subtle direction, suggestions about where I should go, which rooms to avoid, which corridors were just colder. Small instructions that together began to form an invisible map of the mansion, a map I had not helped draw. I started to realize that my steps were no longer entirely mine. One morning, I woke with the sensation of having been watched while I slept. There was no sound, no obvious movement, just that silent certainty installed before my eyes even opened. The room was exactly as I had left it the night before, but something had changed. The floral perfume was stronger, concentrated in the air, as if someone had stayed there for far too long. I rose slowly, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet. As I crossed the room, I noticed a detail that made me stop abruptly. On the dresser lay an object that didn't belong to me, a small antique comb, finely worked metal, marked by visible use. It wasn't dusty. It didn't look forgotten. It looked placed there with intention. I touched it carefully, feeling the cold of the metal. A shiver ran through my arms. That object carried something beyond its material form. There was a disturbing familiarity to it, as if my hand already knew its weight, its texture, its presence. I held the comb in my palm for a few seconds before setting it back down, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. The mansion, however, showed no interest in explanations. It simply presented evidence, one piece after another, with the patience of something that knows it will eventually be understood. When I left the room, I found the romance standing in the corridor, as if waiting for me. There was a calm smile on the face, but the eyes were far too attentive, assessing something I couldn't see. My comment about the object was received with excessive normality, a quick, vague explanation about antiques scattered through the house, nothing that justified the way it had been placed exactly there. I descended the stairs with the growing weight of doubt settling in my chest. In the hall, morning light poured through the tall windows, revealing dust particles suspended in the air. The portraits on the wall seemed different at that hour, not changed, repositioned, or perhaps I was beginning to see them with different eyes. I approached one of them more closely. The woman who had unsettled me the night before appeared again, now in another context. The same serene expression, the same deep gaze. But there was something new. She was wearing a comb remarkably similar to the one I had found in the bedroom. The coincidence was far too precise to ignore. My heart began to race. I followed the side corridor, the one rarely used, and noticed that a door once always locked now stood slightly open. The wood was worn by time, but the lock looked recently handled. I pushed the door gently, the cold air wrapping around me immediately. Beyond it lay an old dressing room, tall wardrobes, mirrors clouded by age, a small window that barely let in light. The scent there was stronger, a mix of stored fabric and ancient perfume. On a chair rested a light, delicate dress, arranged as if someone had just stood up. As I moved closer, I realized the fabric still held a faint warmth. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding. That space was not dormant, it was active, and the mansion seemed determined to show me little by little that I was not the first to occupy that place, nor the first to love within its walls. When I left the room, I found the romance standing at the end of the corridor. The timing of that presence filled me with deep discomfort. There was no reproach in the gaze, only a steady calm, as if everything were unfolding exactly as expected. It was then that I understood something essential, though too painful to fully accept. The house wasn't merely repeating patterns. It was reconstructing a story, and I was beginning to suspect that my role in it had been written long before that night. After that encounter in the corridor, something quietly broke inside me. Not a snap, not a sudden shock. It was more like the slow fracture of an old certainty, the realization that something which had always supported your steps is no longer there and you keep walking only out of habit. I spent the rest of the day pretending at normalcy. I walked through the gardens, watched light filter through the leaves, listened to the wind slip through the cracks of the house. Everything looked the same, and yet everything felt profoundly displaced. The mansion no longer hid its intention to envelop me. It revealed itself calmly, without haste, like something that knows it doesn't need to persuade, only to wait. The romance remained attentive, present, protective. But now there was a layer in its gestures I could no longer ignore. Surveillance disguised as care, constant direction woven into the smallest things, a comment about how much time I spent alone, a suggestion to avoid certain corridors, a gaze that lingered too long when I stopped before an old portrait. It was as if I were being kept within boundaries I hadn't helped define. That night, the mansion's silence presented itself differently. It was no longer just a backdrop. It was an organized, conscious presence. The distant sound of an old clock marked the hours with almost ritual regularity. Each chime reinforced the idea that time there did not move forward. It accumulated. Lying in bed, I tried to sleep, but rest came in fragments. Each time I closed my eyes, images surfaced without warning. Corridors I didn't remember walking, doors opening on their own, feminine hands holding objects that now appeared before me. They weren't full dreams. They were incomplete memories, like pages torn from an old book. During one of those restless waking moments, I smelled the floral perfume again, stronger this time, closer. My heart racing, I opened my eyes, certain I would find someone there. But the room was empty, the curtains still, the door closed, and yet the sense of presence did not fade. I rose slowly and crossed the room, guided by an impulse I no longer tried to understand. The corridor was dark, lit only by faint light from the lower floor. Each step echoed more than it should have, as if the house were amplifying my decision to move forward. That's when I noticed something new. The attic door, still unexplored, stood slightly open. It was impossible not to notice. It stood out in the half-light like a silent invitation, offering not comfort, but answers. The air around it was colder, heavier. An old certainty settled in my chest. That door marked a threshold which, once crossed, would allow no return. I approached cautiously. Before I even touched the handle, I heard a sound from somewhere inside the house. Not a step, not a whisper. Something subtler, the soft shift of fabric, like someone moving slowly on another floor, adjusting their presence to the silence. My first instinct was to retreat, but something stronger held me there, a curiosity that was no longer entirely mine, a calling that didn't come from the romance nor from fear. It came from the house. When I touched the handle, the cold metal pressed against my fingers, solid, real. The contact sent an immediate shiver through me, as if that gesture had been awaited for far too long. For a moment, everything seemed suspended. The clock fell silent, the wind stopped, the entire mansion appeared to hold its breath. And in that exact moment, I understood something that would forever change the way I saw the love that had brought me there. I was not merely living a romance inside the mansion. I was being guided to occupy a place someone else had left behind. And the danger was not only in the house, it was in everything that insisted on keeping me there. After that night, something inside me remained in a constant state of alert. It wasn't overt fear or visible panic. It was a quiet internal vigilance, as if my body had learned before my mind that the house allowed no distractions. Every gesture, every movement, every breath felt observed, not overtly, but with an attention too continuous to ignore. The romance intensified. There was more closeness, more apparent care, more attempts to wrap my days in a sense of absolute protection. But now I could see the other side of that devotion, the way my routines were being shaped without my noticing. Constant, almost tender suggestions about schedules, paths, spaces in the house, a care that didn't ask permission, it simply established itself. The mansion seemed to respond with silent approval. Night sounds became more frequent, yet less chaotic, as if following a pattern. The floral perfume appeared always in the same places, near the staircase, in the upper hallway, by the door of the dressing room, like a carefully maintained trail, an invisible signature. I also started noticing small absences. Objects I clearly remembered seeing in certain places would simply no longer be there. They didn't vanish completely. They reappeared elsewhere in the house, as if someone wanted to make sure I would find them again. An old book on the hall table, a handkerchief forgotten on the armchair in the secondary sitting room, the metal comb returning, now resting beside a mirror I rarely used. The house wasn't hiding its intent to communicate anymore. Through all of it, the romance remained steady, nearly flawless. There was a constant serenity in the way he carried himself, a confidence that clashed with my growing unease. Sometimes I watched him in silence, trying to understand when that comfortable presence had started to feel like a boundary. There was no aggression, no direct threat, only the sense that something in me was being carefully contained. One afternoon, as I walked down the side corridor, I heard a distinct sound. It didn't come from behind me or ahead of me. It came from inside the walls, a low, rhythmic noise, like something being dragged slowly. I stopped instantly, my heart surging. The sound ceased at the exact same moment, leaving a silence so thick it felt like it pressed against my ears. The mansion seemed to be testing my reaction. I kept walking, but sharper now. Every sense awake, every shadow looked deeper, every reflection in the mirror seemed to linger too long. That's when I noticed something new in the portraits. It wasn't just the faces repeating, it was the posture, the angle of the body, the way those women, always women, seemed to occupy the space beside a male figure, positioned almost the same way, again and again. There was a pattern there, an emotional pattern. Those women didn't look happy. They didn't look terrified, either. They wore a kind of silent acceptance, like someone who understood too late that loving, in that place, meant staying. Something in their eyes struck me with unexpected force, the recognition of someone who has asked too many questions and stopped asking. That night, the feeling of being watched became unbearable, and it wasn't only the house, it was the romance. There was a constant attention, a gaze that always seemed 1 second ahead of my thought. Not out of obvious cruelty, but out of certainty, like he knew exactly where I was even while I was still deciding where to go. When I went to my room, I realized the door had been locked from the outside, not violently, not carelessly, intentionally, carefully. The metal of the lock was cold when I touched it, real enough to crush any hope of illusion. I took a slow breath, trying to hold back the immediate surge of panic. A moment later, I heard footsteps in the corridor. The key turned with absolute calm. The door opened. Nothing was said. It didn't need to be. The explanation lived in the serene gesture, in the steady look, in the normalcy with which it was handled. Too much care justified his concern. A simple mistake offered lightly. But in that moment, I understood something essential. I wasn't being protected from the house. I was being kept inside it, and for the first time since I arrived, a clear question formed, direct and impossible to ignore. If that love was my safety, why was it starting to look so much like surveillance? The next morning, the mansion felt deliberately calm. Pale light filtered through the clouds, washing the interior in soft, almost merciful tones, as if the architecture itself were trying to disguise what had happened the night before. But the calm didn't soothe me. It unsettled me more, because it felt rehearsed, like the silence was there to convince me to forget. The romance moved with absolute normality, offering care, attention, presence, small details that, in another context, would have been comfort, but now I felt them as invisible fences. The way he appeared in corridors at exactly the right moment, the way he suggested safer paths, the sentences that always ended with protection, as if protection were the same thing as staying. I smiled when I had to. I nodded when it was convenient, but inside a part of me began moving in secret, like someone preparing to run without knowing whether an exit exists. In that state of internal vigilance, I decided to return to the secondary sitting room where I'd found the porcelain teacup. There was something about that room that felt less aligned with the rest of the house, as if there the mansion spoke louder, less disguised. I moved down the corridor as quietly as possible, watching every shadow, every reflection, every crack in the wood. When I pushed the door open, I found the room exactly as before, and yet different. The teacup was gone. In its place there was an envelope. The paper was thick, yellowed, its edges worn as if it had been handled many times. There was no seal and no visible addressee, only a thin line of ink in the lower corner, almost hidden, the initial of a name. A simple stroke, heavy with intent. The envelope looked too recent for such an old place, and, at the same time, too old to be recent, as if it had crossed through time without aging. I held it carefully, feeling the stiff texture beneath my fingers. For a few seconds I didn't move, listening only to my own breathing. The silence around me felt attentive. No wind, no creak of wood. It was as if the mansion were waiting for my decision with focused patience. When I opened the envelope, the scent of aged paper and floral perfume rose instantly, the same perfume that had followed me since the first night. Inside was a letter folded with precision and a small black and white photograph. The photograph came first, a woman standing in front of the mansion, her body slightly angled, hair pinned neatly, her gaze serious, not sad but aware. Beside her stood a man with an immaculate posture, his face partially shadowed by the angle of the light. The image wasn't sharp, but something in him hit me with the force of involuntary recognition. The features weren't identical, but the presence was the same way of occupying space, the same controlled rigidity, the same impression that everything around him was silent property. My heart started to race. I unfolded the letter slowly, trying to steady the trembling in my hands. The handwriting was elegant and firm, old in its strokes, and the first sentence made me feel as if the air had been pulled out of the room. The letter didn't speak of love as a promise. It spoke of love as an obligation. I didn't read it word by word at first. I read with hungry eyes, grabbing at meaning, catching isolated terms that flashed like blades: protection, debt, repetition, guard, promise, return. It was as if someone had written it to be found by me, not to be read by just anyone. One sentence in the middle of the text stood out with silent violence. Love is not meant to set you free. It is meant to keep you. The sentence felt absurd, and yet it fit too perfectly into the logic of that house. My chest tightened, and an immediate need rose in me to hide the letter, as if holding it was dangerous. But before I could fold it again, another detail froze me. The name signed at the end. It wasn't the romance's name. It wasn't a name I recognized. It was an old name, almost ceremonial, written with the certainty of someone who expects obedience. And beneath the signature, there was a date. Not a year, only the day and the month. The same day I arrived at the mansion. A perfect repetition, as if time had folded over itself. My legs weakened for a moment. I sat down in the armchair, feeling the cold fabric beneath my hands, breathing deeply, trying to stop my mind from running too fast. If that letter existed, someone had placed it there now. It wasn't an object lost in the past. It was a message placed in the present. And if it was a message, then someone, or something, wanted me to know. The mansion was showing me what the romance was trying to conceal. I closed the envelope slowly and tucked the letter and the photograph under my clothing, pressing them against my chest like a secret. When I stood, I felt the air in the room change. A subtle cold gathered along my spine, as if a gaze were approaching without sound. I turned slowly, in the reflection of the old mirror leaning against the wall. I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A shadow, not a diffuse shadow, a defined presence, motionless, occupying the space behind me as if it had always belonged there. There was no clear face, only the shape of someone standing too still, too silent. I blinked, my heart pounding. When I opened my eyes again, the mirror reflected only the empty room, but the cold remained. And in that instant, I understood. The letter wasn't just a clue. It was a warning. The mansion wasn't merely revealing things, it was preparing. Because if love inside that house was an obligation, then I needed to find out what the punishment was for trying to escape. I left the room and closed the door carefully, and that's when I heard it, from the other end of the corridor, a soft, familiar sound, restrained footsteps approaching calmly. The romance was coming toward me, and I still didn't know whether I should hide what I'd found or confront him and risk everything. The footsteps drew closer without hurry, as if the house itself had taught that body how to move without disturbing the silence. I stood in the middle of the corridor, feeling the letter hidden against me like something alive, too warm to be paper. The air felt colder there, and the light streaming through the tall windows fell in pale bands across the floor, stretching the shadows with almost theatrical precision. The romance appeared at the end of the corridor with the same serenity as always. Nothing in his posture suggested urgency, irritation, or surprise. If anything, there was a careful naturalness, as if he expected to find me there. His gaze settled on me with a steady attention that lasted too long to be casual, and for an instant I had the unsettling sense that he wasn't only seeing me, he was measuring the distance between me and the secret I carried. I held his gaze, forcing my body to stay calm. My heart, however, refused to obey. The mansion seemed to hold the air around us. The silence thickened, and even the distant groan of old wood went still. For a few seconds, the corridor became a suspended space between two forces, the promise of protection and the suspicion of captivity. He stepped closer, and I felt the instinctive urge to retreat, even if only by a fraction. I didn't. I stayed where I was, as if I could prove to myself that I still had control of my own body. He made a small gesture, almost affectionate, like he meant to touch my arm, and I noticed, with a clarity that chilled me, that his touch always came at the same moments, when I was too close to something he didn't want me to see. The realization moved through me like ice. I murmured something about getting lost in the corridor. The response came with the same calmness, a faint smile, a comment about how large the mansion is, how its corridors can seem to shift. It could have been casual. It wasn't. There was an implied suggestion inside it. The house confuses you, and you should trust me more than you trust yourself. Trust, until then, had always been where I rested. Now it felt like unstable ground, ready to give way. As we walked together toward the hall, I felt the envelope pressed against my body like a weight dragging my chest downward. The letter seemed to pulse in silence, as if it knew I would try to hide it, and as if it had been made precisely to force the opposite. We descended the stairs, and the mansion began making sounds again, small cracks and creaks, as if it started breathing after holding itself still for too long. In the main room, the light was dimmer. Heavy curtains filtered out the outside world, creating the sense that the house existed outside of time. The scent of flowers was there again, stronger, as if someone had just placed them there. And that's when I realized something else. The romance was never bothered by the perfume. Me. I felt as if it followed me everywhere. At some point that afternoon, the romance stepped away to take care of something I couldn't quite define. It was always like that, short absences, explained with such effortless normality that the explanation itself felt unnecessary, as if trust should already be enough. The moment I was alone, I felt the need to look at the letter again, calmly, not out of curiosity alone, but from something more urgent inside me, as if my body knew I had to understand before the mansion decided, for me. I went back to my room and locked the door from the inside. The gesture stirred an absurd guilt in me, like I was betraying someone simply by wanting privacy. I sat on the edge of the bed and drew out the envelope carefully. The paper felt rougher than before. I opened it again, pulling the letter out with caution, trying to keep my breathing steady. This time, I read more slowly. There was a story beneath the sentences, a woman who had arrived at the mansion under circumstances like mine, a love that presented itself as protection, a silent pact made in the name of a greater good, one that demanded sacrifices. The text never stated the sacrifice outright. It only implied again and again that freedom was a threat and that leaving was a form of betrayal. And then, in the middle of those words, a line hit me with the force of physical recognition. She tried to leave, and the house brought her back. The world seemed to tilt slightly. My fingers tightened around the paper, and a shiver climbed the back of my neck. That wasn't poetic warning. It was a statement, and if it was a statement, then someone had already tried and failed. A faint sound outside the room interrupted my reading. It wasn't the doorknob, it wasn't the door. It was fabric brushing the floor, like a long dress dragging slowly down the hallway. I held my breath and didn't move, waiting for the sound to stop. It stopped. For a few seconds I heard nothing. Then, right near the door, a soft click, like a fingernail tapping wood. My entire body tightened. The idea of opening the door felt absurd, and yet a part of me wanted to look, to confirm, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I stood slowly, moving closer in careful steps. My hand trembled as it approached the handle. Before I touched it, the sound vanished, as if whoever stood on the other side knew exactly when I would react. I backed away, my heart racing too fast to control, and in that instant I understood my danger wasn't singular. There were two presences fighting over my fate, the mansion and the romance, and I no longer knew where one ended and the other began. I slid the letter back into the envelope and hid them in a drawer beneath folded clothes, as if paper could be contained by fabric. But as I shut the drawer, something made me freeze. Among the clothes was a handkerchief I had never seen before, light, delicate, and soaked through with that same floral perfume. I touched it carefully, feeling the thin fabric run between my fingers, and as the scent rose to my face again, a cold certainty formed inside me. Someone was entering my room, even when I locked the door, and if that was true, then I could no longer trust the house, or the love that brought me here. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, listening to the mansion breathe. There was no more attempt at sleep. Sleep had become a luxury that didn't belong in that place. Every creak of wood, every subtle shift in the air felt intentional. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't only being watched, I was being accompanied. When morning came, it brought no relief. Gray light seeped through the gaps in the curtains, revealing a room that looked identical to the night before, and yet now felt foreign. I rose carefully, watching the closed door, the intact lock. Still, The certainty that someone had entered clung to my skin like an invisible residue. I went down to the main room with restrained steps. The house was too silent. There was no sign of the romance. No sounds from other rooms. No obvious presence. Only the floral perfume again, spread through the air like an insistent reminder. It was there, in that excessive quiet, that I decided to do what I'd avoided from the start, to look at the mansion not as shelter, but as archive. I began walking the corridors with methodical attention, pausing before every portrait, every frame, every old photograph. I wasn't searching for vague resemblance anymore. I was searching for patterns, and they appeared with disturbing clarity. The women in the portraits weren't just similar to each other. They repeated in cycles, the same posture, the same kind of dress, the same look, part devotion, part resignation. And beside them, almost always, the male figure appeared with only minor variations, the angle of his face, the cut of his hair, the era suggested by his clothing, but with the same rigid, controlled, constant presence. It was as if time had passed only for them. In one of the more remote corridors, I found a door I'd never noticed before. It wasn't locked. It wasn't hidden. It simply seemed not to exist until that moment. I pushed it gently and stepped into a small office, narrow and quiet, with a desk against the wall and low shelves packed with old folders. The smell in there was different, less floral, drier, old paper, ink, and something faintly metallic. I opened one of the folders with careful hands. Inside were records, letters organized by dates, numbered photographs, small objects wrapped with excessive care. There was no built-up dust. Everything looked recently handled, despite the material's obvious age. That's when I saw the name. It appeared in multiple letters, written in the same firm handwriting each time, repeated like a seal, a signature that crossed decades without changing. It wasn't the romance's name. It wasn't mine. It was a woman's name. The same name was written on the back of one of the photographs I'd seen before, the same name that appeared, nearly illegible, in the lower corner of the letter hidden in the envelope. The repetition made the floor feel as if it shifted beneath my feet. I kept turning pages, and something even more disturbing revealed itself. Beside each set of letters, a date had been marked with care, not a full year, only day and month. Always the same, the day I arrived at the mansion. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I sat in the chair beside the desk, my heart pounding too hard. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't symbolism. It was method, a ritual repeated with obsessive precision. And then I understood the first inescapable truth. I wasn't the exception in that story. I was the continuation. I closed the folder carefully, fighting the immediate urge to run. But run where? The house seemed to know. Every corridor, every door, every window reinforced the feeling that the outside world was only a distant memory, irrelevant. The mansion didn't need to lock exits. It simply made the idea of leaving more and more abstract. A soft sound echoed behind me. I turned quickly, heart punching against my ribs, expecting to find someone there. But the office was empty. Still, the sound came again, a faint slide, like paper being handled in another room, as if someone was reviewing the archive with me, following my discovery with silent interest. I pulled the office door shut behind me as I left, a new weight settling in my chest. It wasn't only fear. It was the understanding that this place didn't tell stories by accident. It recorded, it preserved, it repeated. When I returned to the main room, the romance stood near the staircase, as if he had appeared there at the exact moment I needed to see him. His eyes met mine with an unsettling calm, as if he knew exactly where I'd been. In that moment, something made me shudder from the inside. He didn't need to ask what I discovered. The mansion had already told him, and if that was true, then the love keeping me there was an only feeling. It was part of the mechanism. That meeting in the main room didn't need words to become a confrontation. There was something in the way the romance stood there, motionless, that erased any attempt at normalcy. It wasn't impatient waiting, nor an explicit demand. It was too stable, too fixed, like an anchor point in a space that no longer allowed improvisation. The mansion seemed to agree with that stillness. The air was unmoving, dense, as if every particle had been instructed not to interfere. I took a few steps toward the staircase, feeling his gaze track each movement. There was no reproach in it, only certainty. The certainty of someone who believes time always works in his favor. I passed him without speaking, climbing the steps with a calm that didn't match the chaos inside me. Each step seemed to echo not only in the space, but inside my body, reminding me that rushing to flee would only reinforce the appearance of guilt. I needed to understand. I needed to hear what the house had been trying to say before my own reactions could be used against me. Upstairs, I walked to the corridor of the older rooms. The aligned doors looked even more alike now, as if they'd been copied from the same template. I pushed one of them open, feeling the heavy wood give way with unsettling ease. The room beyond was different from mine, but it carried the same essence. Old furniture, pale fabrics, mirrors positioned to reflect only partial angles of the space. That's where I found the notebook. It lay on a small writing desk, its cover darkened by time, yet surprisingly intact. No padlock, no attempt to hide it. It felt left there for specific hands, my hands. When I opened it, the familiar scent rose again, old paper and floral perfume. The pages were filled with handwriting that shifted subtly over time, yet held a common thread, an identity that stretched across decades. These weren't random notes. They were records. Lives described in the first person, like silent confessions meant for no one, or for someone who did not exist yet. The first pages spoke of arrival, always arrival, the description of the mansion, the strange feeling of welcome, the male figure presented as a safe harbor. The text moved carefully, repeating words and sensations I recognized with growing discomfort. It wasn't just emotional similarity, it was narrative precision. I kept turning pages, my heart beating faster and faster. At a certain point, the notebook marked a shift. The entries grew shorter, more cautious. Mentions of locked doors, of surveillance disguised as care, of an invisible female presence that seemed to follow every step. And then I saw the name again, the same woman's name, written with ceremonial care at the top of a page. Beneath it, a detailed account of how that name wasn't simply identity, it was function. It didn't represent one unique person, but a role occupied, again and again by different women, chosen for emotional resemblance, for a particular vulnerability, for a deep ability to love without demanding immediate return. The name didn't repeat because the woman was the same. The name repeated because the role remained. My chest tightened as I understood the cruel logic behind it. The mansion didn't preserve individuals. It preserved bonds. It preserved emotional structures. And the romance, the one I believed was singular, appeared in those pages as an adaptable constant, a presence that changed shape, era, appearance, but kept the same function, to ensure continuity. I closed the notebook carefully, feeling the weight of the revelation settle inside me. It explained the excessive serenity, the disguised control, the familiarity with the house's rhythms. He wasn't improvising, he was repeating. When I left the room, the corridor was empty, but I didn't feel alone. The mansion felt closer now, as if it had leaned in to hear my reaction. The silence was no longer expectation, it was confirmation. I went down the stairs again, my body feeling heavier, as if every truth I uncovered had increased the gravity of that place. In the main room, the romance was still exactly where I'd left him. His eyes met mine, and for the first time there was no attempt to soften his expression. There was no explicit threat. There was acceptance. In that moment, I understood he didn't need to convince me. The house had already done it for him, and love as I had known it began to come apart, giving way to something older, more rigid, a structure that didn't ask whether I wanted to stay. It simply waited for me to understand why I always did. From then on, every ordinary gesture carried a second intention. Walking the corridors stopped being movement and became calculation. Silence stopped being rest and became strategy. The mansion didn't need to announce danger. It dissolved it into routine, turning the familiar into something carefully hostile. The romance remained there, constant, present, almost beyond reproach. There was tenderness in his gestures, attention in the details, care in the timing. But now I could see the architecture behind it all. Every action seemed designed to reduce my options, to narrow my world until it fit comfortably inside those ancient walls. And the most disturbing part was realizing none of it was done in haste. The house and he shared the same patience. I began watching the windows more closely. Many were sealed, not with boards or chains, but with discreet built-in locks that were nearly invisible at first glance. Others opened only enough to let air in, never enough to suggest passage. The world outside always seemed far away, blurred behind thick glass, like a memory losing sharpness over time. That was when the thought of escape appeared, not as a plan, but as a reflex. It came in a careless instant. As I crossed the inner garden at dusk, the sky was heavy with clouds, and the wind blew harder, stirring dry leaves gathered in the corners. For a brief moment, the iron gate at the far end of the grounds seemed less imposing, almost reachable. The thought crossed my mind too fast to ignore. What if I just went? My body reacted before reason. My heart surged, my muscles tightened, as if that possibility had awakened something long asleep. But the mansion's response was immediate. The wind stopped abruptly, silence dropped like weight, and without me hearing movement, I felt his presence behind me. He didn't touch, he didn't speak, he was simply there, too close to be coincidence. The sensation of being watched in my thought, not only in my actions, made me shudder. That night, the house felt more active than ever. The sounds grew more frequent, less subtle. Doors creaked open on their own. Floorboards snapped in distant places, as if someone was walking without any clear destination. The floral perfume spread into rooms where it had never appeared before, creating the impression that the mansion was marking territory. Lying in bed, I tried to organize my thoughts. If there were others before me, then there were patterns, and if there were patterns, there were flaws. No structure is perfect when it relies on human repetition. Something always slips, something always changes. I needed to find the mistake. I began replaying details that had seemed insignificant: the rarely used side corridor, the door that had appeared without warning, the hidden office, the attic that had remained a silent boundary from the beginning. There were spaces in the mansion that didn't feel fully integrated into the logic of control, spaces less watched, less repeated. The attic returned to my mind with insistence. It had always been described as useless, too cold, full of old things with no value, a place the romance never encouraged me to visit, but never explicitly forbade either. That absence of guidance suddenly felt meaningful. I decided I had to go up there, not immediately, not impulsively. The mansion responded badly to impulses. I would have to be patient like it was, watch schedules, movements, absences, wait for a moment when the vigilance loosened, even slightly. But the house seemed to sense my internal shift. In the early hours, I woke to a dry sound from the hallway, not a step, something heavier, more defined. I sat up, my heart hammering. The sound came again, closer. Then I heard something that turned my blood cold, the slow drag of a heavy piece of furniture being moved somewhere on the lower floor. The mansion was rearranging itself. I got up and approached the door carefully, pressing my ear against the cold wood. On the other side, absolute silence, no breath, no perceptible movement, and still I knew something had changed in the house's configuration. When I stepped back, I noticed a new detail in my room. The chair by the writing desk had been moved a few inches, now placed directly beneath the window. I didn't remember leaving it that way. The placement didn't look random. It looked like a suggestion. The house was telling me where to look. I went to the window and, for the first time since arriving, I saw something different outside. Between the farthest trees, almost hidden by dense vegetation, there was a narrow path I'd never noticed. It wasn't a clear trail, just a subtle cut through the growth, as if someone had walked there repeatedly, always trying not to leave signs. My heart raced. That wasn't just a possibility. It was a route. And in that instant, I understood the idea of escape wasn't only mine. Someone before me had tried too. The next morning, I woke with the feeling the mansion had been awake all night. It wasn't vague intuition. It was a heavy certainty lodged in my body, as if rest had been purely physical. The silence that greeted me was different, cleaner, more organized, like a room after careful tidying. I went downstairs cautiously, watching for anything that might reveal subtle changes. In the main room, the furniture looked slightly shifted, not enough to scream at first glance, but enough to suggest someone had recalculated the space. The old clock marked the hours with the same cadence, and yet the sound felt closer, as if it had been moved a few inches toward me. The romance still wasn't there. His absence created a rare opening. I sensed it was one of the few moments when human vigilance decreased, even if the house's vigilance remained absolute. I followed the impulse without letting it turn into anxiety. The mansion reacted badly to haste. I needed to act like it did, with method. I went to the side corridor and walked straight to the hidden office. The door opened easily, and the dry scent of old paper wrapped around me again. I closed it behind me, not to guarantee privacy, I already knew that was an illusion, but to reduce distractions. I went straight to the folders I'd left nearly untouched the day before. This time, I searched for physical marks, corners too worn, pages folded, small notes in the margins. I found a set that was different from the others, identified not by a name, but by a discrete pencil symbol in the upper corner. A broken line. Inside were fragmented accounts, more disorganized, written in obvious haste. The sentences were short, uneven, as if recorded in hiding. The tone was different, less resigned, more urgent. That woman had not accepted the role assigned to her. She had written about the path. I recognized the description immediately. Closed-in trees, dense vegetation, a stretch where the soil sank slightly underfoot, demanding care not to leave marks. The trail didn't lead straight to the main gate. It curved around the property, avoiding visible points. The text mentioned specific hours, moments when the house seemed asleep. My heart surged as I realized the route I'd seen from the window wasn't imagination. Someone had used it before. I kept reading, feeling the weight of it build. The attempt had been careful, nearly successful. The woman described the growing sensation of freedom, the air changing density as she moved farther from the mansion. For a few paragraphs, the writing seemed to breathe hope. Then the sentences stopped. The last page held no complete words, only irregular ink marks, as if the hand had been yanked hard, or as if the time to write had been violently stolen away. In the lower corner, one single word stood with painful clarity: back. I closed the folder carefully, a deep cold settling in my stomach. She had gotten too close. And if she'd been brought back, it wasn't by accident. The house didn't correct mistakes with immediate violence. It waited, it adjusted, it reabsorbed. When I left the office, I felt the silence shift again. It wasn't absence anymore. It was approach. Soft steps echoed somewhere far off, and the floral perfume surged, filling the corridor like a late warning. I needed to get out. I went upstairs quickly, controlling every movement so I wouldn't betray haste. My room greeted me with the same appearance as always, but something new caught my attention immediately. On the bed, perfectly folded, lay a coat I didn't recognize. The fabric was old, heavy, visibly worn. When I touched it, it held the cold of something long stored, yet there was still a faint residual warmth. In the inner pocket, I found something small and rigid, a key. It wasn't a key for an ordinary door. The shape was old, the metal worn, as if it had been used many times. A discreet symbol was engraved at its base, the same broken line I'd seen on the folder. The meaning hit me with cruel clarity. The woman who had almost escaped had left it behind, not by mistake but as possibility. An error not fully corrected, a flaw the house had chosen to ignore, or maybe a test. I slipped the key away carefully, feeling the real weight of something that, for the first time since arriving, didn't seem to belong to the mansion. It didn't smell like flowers. It carried no soaked-in memory. It was only cold metal and possibility. When I heard footsteps approaching my room, I knew the window of observation had closed. Human vigilance was returning, synchronized with the house. But something inside me had shifted. Now I wasn't only thinking about escaping, I was thinking about when. From the moment I hid the key, the mansion seemed to change its mood. Not suddenly, not theatrically, more like the subtle shift in air that comes before a storm, even while the sky is still bright. The corridors looked the same. The furniture didn't move in plain sight, but there was a new tension, a rigidity in the silence that hadn't been there before. I spent the day pretending normalcy. I stayed in the most visible rooms, accepted the romance's constant presence, smiled when expected, and yet the mansion seemed to watch beyond gestures. It reacted to what wasn't said, to what wasn't done. The mere existence of intention felt enough to put it on alert. Night sounds returned earlier that evening, not occasional creaks, clear shifts, furniture being moved, doors closing on their own with more force than necessary. The floral perfume grew heavier, almost suffocating, spreading through every room as if the house wanted to stamp each space with its identity. And then I understood. The mansion was not passive in the face of escape. It didn't wait to be challenged. It anticipated. I started tracking the hours with obsessive attention. There were moments when the romance stepped away for short stretches, always explainable, always predictable. There were also instants when the house seemed quieter, as if it had focused its attention somewhere else. Those windows were brief, but they existed, and I needed them. The next night, I woke to the sound of something falling on the lower floor. It wasn't an accident. It was a sharp, deliberate impact. I stayed still in bed, heart pounding as I listened to footsteps move below. Slow, measured. They weren't ordinary human steps. They were steps that knew the house better than any living body. When silence returned, I rose carefully and approached the door. I pressed my ear against the cold wood and felt a faint vibration, almost electrical, running through the surface. The mansion was awake, and it seemed angry. I returned to the room and pulled the key from its hiding place. The metal was icy, heavy, too real to be a symbol. The broken line engraved at its base looked deeper now, as if it had been redrawn. Holding it brought a paradoxical sensation, fear and clarity. That wasn't just an object, it was a decision. I decided to test its limits. I waited until the house reached that peculiar silence, the exact moment when every sound stopped completely, as if everything held its breath at once. I left my room in careful steps and headed for the side corridor. The door that always stayed shut was locked. The lock looked different, newer. The mansion had reinforced that point. I backed away and tried another route. Every attempt met resistance. Doors that had once been accessible were closed. Corridors felt longer, more confusing. It was as if the architecture had been reorganized to tire me out, to disorient me. The house didn't need to block escape directly. It only had to make it impossible to map. That's when I understood something essential. The mansion wasn't reacting only to movement. It was reacting to intention. The more I thought about leaving, the more it closed. I returned to my room, body taut, mind at full alert. When I stepped inside, I noticed something new on the desk. Small, placed with excessive precision. An antique brooch, shaped like a flower, made of darkened metal. I recognized it instantly. It was identical to the one I'd seen in several old photographs, pinned to the clothing of the women in the portraits. The message was clear. The house knew. I held the brooch for a few seconds, feeling the symbolic weight of the gesture. It wasn't a direct threat. It was a reminder, a quiet warning that others had thought the way I was thinking, and that the house still carried them. Somehow, when I heard footsteps in the hallway, I slipped the brooch away and sat on the bed, pretending calm. The romance entered with a serene expression, but something in his eyes was different, more fixed, less disguised. He scanned the room a second longer than usual before looking directly at me. In that instant, I understood. The surveillance had tightened. There was no longer room for small mistakes. The mansion didn't like plans, and if I wanted to get out, I would have to act before it decided to act for me. The decision didn't come as sudden courage. It came as exhaustion, a deep fatigue, of existing under watch, of breathing air that didn't belong to me, of loving something that demanded my staying as proof. I understood then that waiting longer wouldn't bring clarity. It would only strengthen the control. I chose the next night. The house was too silent when I woke, as if it had been instructed not to move. The old clock marked an imprecise hour, its hands nearly still, suggesting time there followed other rules. I rose carefully, feeling the cold floor under my feet, and dressed in simple clothes chosen not for comfort, but for movement. Every gesture calculated, every breath contained. I took the key from its hiding place and held it for a few seconds as if it could offer some form of absolution. The metal was cold but steady, real. It was all I had. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The dimness felt thicker than ever, as if the light had been drawn into the walls. I took a few steps and immediately felt the difference. The air was heavier, resistant, like forward motion required physical effort. I ignored it and headed toward the side staircase, the one rarely used. As I descended the first steps, I heard it, not behind me. From the house itself, a deep, dry crack reverberated through the walls, followed by a long groan, wood forced to move. I froze, heart hammering. The sound stopped. Silence returned, now weighted with expectation. I kept going. Each step felt taller than the last. The railing was icy, damp in a way that wasn't only night cold. When I reached the lower floor, I realized something had changed. The corridor leading to the side door seemed narrower, as if the walls had drawn closer by fractions. Claustrophobia hit hard, but I didn't retreat. I reached the door. The lock was old, unlike the others. I slipped the key in carefully and felt the perfect fit, too precise to be chance. I turned it slowly. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then, one dry click, and a deeper sound, as if something farther inside had been released. Before I could pull the door open, the mansion reacted. The floor vibrated beneath my feet, not violently, but enough to throw off my balance. A sound rippled through the corridors, doors opening and shutting on their own in sequence, like a warning spreading through the entire structure. The floral perfume turned suffocating, too intense to be scent. It was presence. The light flickered. A sharp cold ran down my spine as I realized the house wasn't trying to stop me physically. It was trying to confuse me, disorient me, reposition me. I forced the door. It yielded only a few inches before slamming into a sudden resistance. Beyond the crack, I didn't see the outside I expected, but a dense darkness, depthless, as if night had been compressed into a solid mass. An icy wind escaped through the gap, carrying a distant sound, not natural, but rhythmic, almost like deep breathing. Panic hit my body instantly. I stumbled back, bracing against the wall. My heart was too loud. The air felt scarce. The mansion had made its message clear. That was not an ordinary exit. Maybe it never had been. That's when I heard footsteps from the main staircase. Slow, steady, human. I recognized the rhythm before I saw him. The romance appeared at the far end of the corridor, his silhouette cut by the unstable light. There was no surprise on his face, no anger, only a quiet acceptance, almost compassionate. The way he looked at me dissolved the last of my doubt. He knew. He had always known. And as the mansion shifted around us, rearranging with silent precision, I understood that my escape attempt hadn't merely been observed. It had been allowed to teach me something. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with everything that had been contained until then. The mansion seemed to settle, as if it had reached the exact point it wanted. The walls stopped their subtle movements, the noises withdrew, and even the floral perfume softened. becoming a constant background, almost resigned. He walked closer without hurry. Each step felt calculated not to reach me, but to reinforce the impossibility of any other path. The distance between us shrank, and with it shrank the illusion of choice I was still trying to hold. The look in his eyes didn't carry victory. It carried recognition, as if at last I were exactly where I had always been meant to be. I felt the urge to speak, anything to break the moment, but no words came. Not only because of fear, but because of the bitter understanding forming slowly. Everything I could say had already been anticipated by the house. Everything I could ask had already been answered, by gestures, patterns, repetitions. He stopped just a few steps away. Flickering light cast shadows across his face, making it hard to tell where the person I had loved ended and where the role he served began. For the first time, I saw something essential. There was no contradiction there. Care and control were not opposites. They were parts of the same gesture. The mansion seemed to breathe with us. The air shifted subtly, as if something had finally aligned. My chest tightened as I realized he didn't need to explain. The story had already done it for him. The records, the letters, the portraits, everything pointed toward the same structure. Someone had to remain, someone had to love, someone had to accept, and I had been chosen not in spite of who I was, but because of it. I understood then that the romance had never been only between the two of us. There had always been a third element, silent and absolute, shaping every gesture, every closeness, every promise. He hadn't brought me there by chance. It hadn't been a shared escape. It had been a patient escort. The mansion didn't control him. They cooperated. I felt the key still trapped between my fingers, cold metal pressing into my skin. Its presence felt almost ironic now. It wasn't a real exit. It was a variable inserted into the structure, a possibility allowed only to reinforce the boundary, a loyalty test, not freedom. He finally broke the silence, not with words, but with a simple gesture. He extended his hand toward me. There was no force in it, no urgency, just a calm offer, almost gentle, as if everything could return to balance if I accepted. The outstretched hand didn't ask for explicit submission. It asked for continuity. My body hesitated, split between the instinct to step back and the familiarity of that gesture. How many times had I taken that hand before? How many times had I mistaken comfort for shelter? The memory of those surrenders surged back, bringing a dull, deep ache. In the distance, the old clock began marking the hours again. One dry beat, then another. Time resumed its course. The air shifted subtly, as if something had finally aligned. My chest tightened as I realized he didn't need to explain. The story had already done it for him. The records, the letters, the portraits, everything pointed toward the same structure. Someone had to remain, someone had to love, someone had to accept, and I had been chosen not in spite of who I was, but because of it. I understood then that the romance had never been only between the two of us. There had always been a third element, silent and absolute, shaping every gesture, every closeness, every promise. He hadn't brought me there by chance. It hadn't been a shared escape. It had been a patient escort. The mansion didn't control him. They cooperated. I felt the key still trapped between my fingers, cold metal pressing into my skin. Its presence felt almost ironic now. It wasn't a real exit. It was a variable inserted into the structure, a possibility allowed only to reinforce the boundary, a loyalty test, not freedom. He finally broke the silence, not with words, but with a simple gesture. He extended his hand toward me. There was no force in it, no urgency, just a calm offer, almost gentle, as if everything could return to balance if I accepted. The outstretched hand didn't ask for explicit submission. It asked for continuity. My body hesitated, split between the instinct to step back and the familiarity of that gesture. How many times had I taken that hand before? How many times had I mistaken comfort for shelter? The memory of those surrenders surged back, bringing a dull, deep ache. In the distance, the old clock began marking the hours again. One dry beat, then another. Time resumed its course. And I understood. The mansion didn't punish those who tried to flee. It simply offered choices that weren't truly choices. Staying meant safety. Resisting meant wear. And sooner or later, exhaustion always won. But something in me still resisted. Not with hope, but with lucidity. I saw that he wasn't only the guardian of that structure. He was also its prisoner. A role preserved through generations, adapted to new faces, new eras, but always the same in what mattered. He didn't need to like it. He only needed to continue. His hand stayed there, and I knew that taking it wouldn't end the fear. It would begin something deeper, something harder to break. In that suspended moment between the gesture and the decision, I understood that surviving in that house was not the same as living, and that loving, inside those walls, always demanded a price. Accepting that hand wasn't an act of instant surrender. It was slow, almost imperceptible, like my body decided before my awareness could catch up. My fingers touched his carefully, feeling a steady warmth, too human for what it represented. The contact didn't bring relief. It brought confirmation. The mansion reacted immediately. There was no sharp noise, no visible impact, only a deep, silent adjustment like something clicking into its proper place. The air seemed to move more freely again. That near-electric tension in the walls eased. The floral perfume softened, spreading more evenly, less invasive. It was as if the house approved. He didn't smile. That absence of celebration made everything more disturbing. There was no victory in the gesture, only continuity, as if this had been expected from the beginning, as if my attempt to flee had been merely a necessary step so I could understand the structure I'd been placed inside. He released my hand with the same calmness with which he'd offered it, turning toward the interior of the mansion. The instruction was clear. I was meant to follow. And without realizing when it had become natural, I did. We walked the corridors in silence, but the road wasn't random. We passed spaces I already knew, and others that, until then, seemed not to exist at all. Doors appeared where there had been only wall. The path revealed a side of the house that never showed itself to anyone who resisted. We descended a narrow staircase into a lower level, older, where natural light barely reached. The smell down there was different, less floral, more mineral, like damp stone and aged metal. The mansion felt raw in that place, less concerned with pretending to be welcoming. He stopped at a heavy door made of dark wood, carved with deep grooves. There was no visible lock, only a symbol carved into the center, the broken line, the same symbol as the key, the same symbol on the folders, the same symbol tied to the escape that had almost worked. When he pushed the door open, it revealed a wide, circular room with walls lined with niches. In each niche there were objects, carefully arranged letters, small personal belongings, photographs, folded fabrics. They weren't random relics. They were fragments of lives. Understanding hit me hard. That wasn't storage. It was a memorial. Each set seemed to belong to a different woman. Small details varied, the era suggested by the clothing, the paper, the style of the photos, but the organization was identical, a repetition that felt almost ritual, as if the mansion needed to preserve not only the function, but the feeling of each passage. My chest tightened when I saw one niche still empty, clean, prepared, waiting. The romance stayed silent, letting me look, letting me understand. There was no urgency. He knew that once I saw it, there was no returning to ignorance. Truth didn't set you free in that place. It dragged you deeper. The mansion seemed to pulse around us like a satisfied organism. There was no hostility there. There was belonging, a belonging built on the idea that someone had to remain so everything could keep working. I looked at him, searching for any trace of the person I thought I'd loved. What I found was more complicated. There was weariness there, not physical but structural, a kind of exhaustion that didn't come from sharp suffering but from centuries of repetition. He wasn't only a jailer, he was a gear. And then I understood the cruelest trap of that house. It didn't demand obedience by force, it demanded understanding. Once you understood the system, resisting began to feel like selfishness. Staying began to feel like responsibility. The choice hadn't been only taking his hand. The choice had been accepting the role. And in that moment I realized surviving that mansion would be far harder than escaping it. It would mean continuing. After that descent, nothing ever returned to exactly what it had been. There was no dramatic shift, no visible transformation I could point to. What happened was subtler, and because of that, more terrifying. It was as if something had been authorized, as if by understanding the system I had made room for it to operate fully inside me. The following days arranged themselves with a strange smoothness. I woke at the same hour every morning, before the house made a single sound. The floral perfume no longer appeared as warning. It had become part of the air, constant, almost neutral. The corridors felt easier to cross, less confusing. I didn't get lost anymore. And that predictability frightened me more than chaos ever had. I began noticing small changes in myself, not in my body, but in my gestures. The way my hands rested on old furniture, the excessive care with which I touched certain objects, the automatic impulse to straighten frames that sat slightly crooked. They were movements I didn't remember learning, yet they rose with unsettling naturalness. The house was teaching me without words. At certain moments I had the clear sensation of repeating scenes that had happened before. Walking to the corridor window at dusk, stopping in front of a specific portrait without knowing why. lingering a few seconds too long before the old mirror upstairs, watching not only my reflection but something beyond it, a faint overlap, as if another presence had lined itself up with mine. The romance remained present, but in a different way now. There was less explicit surveillance and more quiet trust, as if the house had taken over most of the control. He watched me with a new attention, almost too careful, like someone observing a delicate transition. He no longer tried to guide me. I was already walking the right paths on my own. That terrified me. One afternoon, while reorganizing a shelf in the side parlor, I found something I didn't remember seeing before, a thin notebook with a pale cover, different from the others. When I opened it, the impact hit immediately. The handwriting wasn't old, it was far too familiar. I recognized my own strokes. The pages contained notes I didn't remember writing, fragments of thought, descriptions of the house, observations, about schedules, scents, sensations. Some pages were blank but held faint pressure marks, as if they'd been written on and erased over and over. Others held incomplete sentences, cut off halfway, as if something had pulled my attention before I could finish. The shock didn't arrive as immediate panic. It arrived as deep cold, slow, devastating understanding. The house didn't only want my physical presence, it demanded mental continuity. I started having short lapses, nearly imperceptible. Moments when I was in one room and then realized I'd moved to another without remembering the path. They weren't full blackouts. They were transitions too smooth to notice in the instant they happened. The mansion wasn't stealing time, it was folding it. At night, the dreams intensified. I dreamed scenes I didn't recognize as mine, yet they carried emotions too intimate to feel foreign. I dreamed of old arrivals, of other women crossing the same gate, feeling the same mix of relief and unease. I dreamed of feminine hands holding the same key, hesitating before the same door, making the same choice. When I woke, fragments came with me, like displaced memories. Sometimes it took seconds to recognize my own room. Other times, I called objects by names I didn't remember learning. That's when I understood the next step in the mechanism. The mansion didn't replace people, it layered them. Every woman who stayed there didn't vanish completely. She dissolved. Her gestures, her choices, her fears became part of a repertoire the house reused. I wasn't being erased, I was being added. The romance seemed to know. There was something in his gaze, care mixed with quiet sorrow, like someone watching an irreversible process with the obligation to see it through. He didn't have to tell me. What was happening was already showing itself in me. One night, passing by a mirror, I stopped abruptly. For a split second, the reflection didn't obey me precisely. My arm's movement lagged by a fraction. The eyes in the glass looked older, more tired. I blinked and everything snapped back into place, but the impact stayed. The house wasn't only keeping me, it was using me as a surface, and in that moment of painful lucidity, I understood that escaping late wouldn't mean only leaving the place. It would mean leaving parts of myself behind, parts that might never again belong to me completely. There was a moment, short, precise, impossible to dismiss, when I realized the house had gone too far. It wasn't a dramatic event or an explosive revelation. It was something small, human, a detail that cracked the silent logic I'd been accepting. I forgot my own name, not a full blackout, a hesitation, a tiny gap between the internal question and the answer that didn't come right away. A void too brief to alarm an outside observer, but deep enough to hit me like a blow. The name returned seconds later, as if reluctantly handed back. But something had broken. From that instant on, I understood there was no more time. The mansion didn't advance in sudden steps. It didn't need to. Its method was dilution, just a little each day. A gesture absorbed here, a thought replaced there, until at some point there was no contrast left to produce resistance. So I began to act with absolute discretion. I didn't just fake normalcy, I embodied it. I moved through the corridors with perfect naturalness, performed gestures the house recognized as appropriate, stayed within expected hours. The mansion responded by easing its direct attention, not because it trusted me, because I had learned to imitate it. The romance seemed satisfied. There was a new serenity in his posture, as if the transition was unfolding within schedule. He watched me less, spoke less. The house did the work for him now, and that reduction in human vigilance opened a tiny crack, and I clung to it. I went back down to the lower level, to the memorial, at an hour I knew fell outside the usual pattern of observation. The niches remained silent, organized, still. I walked between them carefully, feeling the symbolic weight of that place intensify with every step. I stopped at the empty niche, the one I'd recognized before as prepared for me. Being that close triggered something I didn't expect. A sudden pressure in my chest, followed by overlapping images, hands that weren't mine touching objects I recognized, decisions I didn't remember making, farewells that never happened. The house reacted to my presence there like an organism defending a vital organ. I forced myself to stay. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Deep inside the empty niche, nearly invisible, there was a mark on the wall, a symbol different from the broken line, an irregular carved gouge, as if someone had tried to scratch something out by force. The earlier attempt, the woman who had almost escaped hadn't only failed to run, she'd failed to erase her resistance, and the house didn't like evidence. The understanding landed with brutal clarity. Escape could not happen after the niche was fully occupied. Once that space was filled, once I became record, there would be no exit possible. The garden path, the key, the symbols, all of it existed only while I was not yet completely integrated. I went back to my room that night with my mind in urgent silence. The lapses were becoming more frequent. Sometimes I started one action and finished another. Sometimes I found myself holding objects without remembering going to get them. The mirror no longer offered only an occasional overlap. Now there were instants when the reflection seemed to move with subtle autonomy. The house was accelerating, and then I heard it, not from the walls, not from the corridors, from inside my own room. A soft, rhythmic sound, almost too quiet to hear. I recognized it with a physical jolt. Pages turning. I turned slowly. On the desk, the pale-covered notebook, the one with my handwriting, was open. The pages were moving on their own, turning one by one as if someone were writing without a visible hand. Words appeared slowly, the ink forming with terrifying precision. It was describing my day, every gesture, every hesitation, every thought I had believed was private. The last line formed with cruel patience. Tomorrow she will accept to remain. The air vanished from my lungs. In that moment I understood the climax wouldn't be physical. It would be a race against assimilation, against the point where the house would decide before I could even think. The key was still with me. The path still existed, but time no longer did. And if I didn't act before the next night, there would be no one left to run, only something to be kept. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, watching the mansion in silence, as if staying perfectly still could help me anticipate its movements. The house didn't seem restless. If anything, it felt deeply calm, satisfied, like it had already won. That tranquility was the clearest warning of all. I knew it was my last chance, not because the path would vanish or the key would disappear, but because something in me was about to become irreversible. Losing my name had been only the beginning. Forgetting was advancing now in subtler, more treacherous layers. Emotions arrived before reasons, gestures before choices. The house was taking command in advance. I got up before dawn. I took nothing with me but the key. No personal object, no keepsake, no attempt to preserve who I had been. With bitter clarity, I understood that carrying too much would offer anchors. The mansion fed on bonds. I had to empty myself. I crossed the corridors with steady steps, without hesitation. The house reacted late, as if startled by the absence of fear. The walls stayed still. The sounds didn't rise. The floral perfume was faint, almost non-existent. For the first time, I felt I had stepped out of the rhythm it knew. I reached the side door without obstacles. I inserted the key. This time the fit was different. The metal vibrated slightly, releasing a low, deep sound that traveled through the floor under my feet. The click didn't come at once. The lock resisted, as if considering. Then it gave with a dry snap that seemed to echo inside my chest. The door opened. On the other side, the air was different, lighter, less stable. It wasn't full freedom, not yet, but it was contrast sharp enough to wound the house's logic. I stepped forward, feeling uneven ground beneath my feet, and the world seemed to reassemble itself around me. That's when the mansion truly reacted, not with sudden movement, but with presence. A pressure slammed into my back, like the space itself was being compressed. I heard the old clock strike out of rhythm, wrong, deliberate. The walls began to pop with long, deep cracks, like bones adjusting. And then I felt something worse. Not footsteps, internal voices, thoughts that weren't mine started, layering over my own, trying to convince me I was wrong, that staying was care, that leaving was abandonment. They weren't commands. They were borrowed memories, emotions from other women who had felt the same fear, the same hesitation, and had stepped back. The house was using what I carried inside me against me. I staggered, bracing myself against the outer wall, forcing focus. The narrow path between the trees was there exactly as described. I followed it, branches scraping my skin, vegetation closing behind me with unnatural speed. Every step demanded effort, physical and mental. Every meter forward felt like something being torn out of me. That's when I felt the first real loss, a simple, everyday memory, the face of someone I had loved before the mansion, dissolved without warning. There was no immediate pain, just a sudden emptiness too clean. The shock came a heartbeat later, along with brutal understanding. The house wouldn't stop me from leaving. It would charge me. I kept going, even as my mind wavered, even as the inner images broke apart. The path steepened, the air thinned. Behind me, I felt the mansion's presence stretching beyond its physical boundaries, like a shadow that didn't respect fences. Then something broke, not in the house, in me. A silent decision formed with absolute clarity. If I kept trying to preserve everything I was, I wouldn't get out. The mansion would win by accumulation. I had to offer something deliberately, an intentional sacrifice, not one taken from me. I stopped in the middle of the path. I closed my eyes, and I let go. Not a random memory, something central. Something that had defined me for a long time. The deep hunger for belonging I'd always chased in other places. The need to be chosen, protected, kept. I released it. The sensation was physical. A violent pressure in my chest, followed by a sudden lightness so sharp it made me dizzy. The world seemed to pull away for a moment, and the pressure behind me eased. The mansion answered with a low, deep sound, like a contained lament. It couldn't use what I no longer carried. I started walking again, unsteady, but with something new, clarity. The path opened ahead, less dense, less resistant. The vegetation no longer closed with the same aggression. The air grew lighter with every step. When I finally reached the edge of the property, my body gave out. I dropped to my knees, gasping, cold earth under my hands. Behind me, the mansion stood upright, silent, motionless. It didn't advance. It didn't call. It only watched. I had gotten out, but I knew, with a certainty that would never leave me, that the escape hadn't been free. Something in me had stayed behind, and it would never return. I stayed there for what felt like an undefined length of time, kneeling in the cold dirt, breathing like someone relearning a basic function. My body shook, not from fear, but from recalibration, as if the world demanded a slow reintroduction to the idea of existing outside that ancient architecture. When I managed to stand, the mansion was still visible in the distance. It didn't move. It didn't approach. It didn't look wounded. That was what disturbed me most. There was no rage in its stillness. There was acceptance, as if the ending had been anticipated from the beginning, as if the house knew not everyone would remain, but anyone who escaped would never leave whole. The mansion didn't need to retrieve what it lost. It had taken enough. I walked away without looking back again. The road ahead looked almost offensively ordinary. Ordinary trees, ordinary dirt, ordinary sky. Normality weighed more than terror, because it demanded something the mansion never required, responsibility for myself. The hours that followed were fragmented. I remember walking until my feet went numb. I remember finding a narrow road. I remember a vehicle passing in the distance, a face glancing at me with brief curiosity before continuing on. I didn't ask for help. I didn't know how yet. The world didn't feel hostile. It felt indifferent, and that indifference hurt. In the days that followed, I began learning what I had left behind. Not something I could point to precisely. No single memory, no missing name. It was subtler than that, an emotional layer that used to make me seek shelter in presences that were too firm, in promises that sounded like destiny. I didn't feel that anymore. The absence wasn't exactly pain. It was a new silence inside me, a space that had once been occupied by a constant expectation of being chosen. Now that space stayed empty, and sometimes that emptiness scared me more than the mansion ever had. At night, the dreams still came, not as clear nightmares, but as echoes. Corridors without defined walls, floral perfume appearing for an instant and vanishing before I could react. An old clock marking hours that didn't match real time. I always woke before any face could fully form. I never saw the romance again, but I knew he was still there, not only as a man, but as a function, as continuity. The mansion hadn't been destroyed, it hadn't been exorcised. It simply kept existing, waiting for the next emotional breaking point, the next person who would mistake shelter for prison. I survived, but surviving wasn't the same as winning. Because some nights, when the world is too quiet, I still feel something shift inside me, not as a desire to return, but as recognition. A part of me knows exactly where that house is, how to reach it, how to cross its gate without resistance. That part never left, and maybe it never will. And then I understood the hardest truth to accept. It wasn't the mansion that almost destroyed me. It was the part of me that wanted to stay, That's the inheritance I carry now, not as a curse, as vigilance. Because I know there are places that don't lock their doors. They only wait until you need to enter. Over time, I learned to recognize the signs before they became invitations. I learned to look at places more carefully, to distrust comfort that arrives too quickly, promises that seem to know exactly what's missing inside me. The mansion taught me that, not out of kindness but out of scar tissue. Life went on, not spectacularly, not marked by grand reinventions. It continued in quiet lines, ordinary jobs, faces that came and went, conversations cut short before they could become too deep. I lived with constant attention, like someone who has already crossed a territory where distraction is expensive. Sometimes, in towns that are too small or on roads that are too long, I feel something shift inside me. It isn't longing, it's recognition, a kind of bodily memory that doesn't need images to speak. The air changes density, silence gains weight, and for a brief moment, I know certain places are still looking for me. I never smelled floral perfume the same way again. Flowers stopped being just flowers. They became questions. I avoid gardens that are too orderly, houses that are too old, buildings that seem to have survived, not by accident, but by insistence. And still, I know it isn't possible to avoid everything. The world is full of doors that don't look like doors at first glance. Some nights I wake with the certainty I've forgotten something important, not a name, not a face, but a feeling. Something that once made me more available to captivity, more inclined to confuse care with possession. When I try to retrieve what it was, I find only a vague outline, an absence that no longer hurts, but still defines my limits. Maybe that was the true price. I didn't lose who I was. I lost who I could have become inside that house. And strangely, that saved me. Sometimes I imagine someone is crossing the mansion's gates right now. Someone too tired to notice the signs, someone wounded enough to mistake welcome for destiny. The house will know, it always knows, and it will offer exactly what that person needs to hear. I don't feel guilt for not going back. I don't feel responsible for warning anyone. Some stories can only be learned by living them, and some kinds of survival don't allow heroism. If I'm telling this now, it isn't to warn or to persuade. It's only to record, because I know places like that don't need to be remembered to exist. They live in emotional fissures, in quiet hunger, in promises that feel too ancient to question. The mansion is still there, not as a constant threat, as a possibility. And I'm still here, not whole, not broken, just aware, because there are nights, like the one that turned my romance into survival, that don't end when the sun rises. They only change shape and learn how to wait.